This is the RPG Crawler here with another shelf of many things, where I take a look at indie and small press tabletop role-playing games and RPG accessories. This time I'm taking a look at another OSR game that's actually been sitting on my shelf and alternately on my desk for quite some time now. The Adventurer Conqueror King System from Autark. Now, some of my longtime viewers have likely heard me speak of this system in a complimentary manner before, and it is true that I like a great many elements of this system right out of the box, but I'm also aware of its flaws. So as always, I will try very hard to approach this in a fair and thorough manner, at least as much as I might. Further, I am mostly going to focus on only the core book on this video, although I will eventually name some other ones towards the end, simply because the core book is all you really need for this particular system. Published apparently back in 2014, Adventurer Conqueror King System is oddly enough not strictly a retro clone in the classic sense, but rather an OSR game that shares the same sorts of systems and mathematics of the BX series, but with a slightly different approach, different class list, normalized systems, and a focus on a whole game style of approach, with systems built in not just for standard adventuring, but also for running domains, businesses, and trade, as well as much more, along with appropriate world-building rules to support those systems, all with the intention of allowing characters to go from basic adventurer to conquering and then ruling their own domain, a focus that was common in certain older editions of role-playing games. Adventurer Conqueror King System, or ACE, is available in both hard copy and PDF format, with the PDF clocking in at about 270 pages, including cover and end material. The hardback, at least with the printing I got, is quite durable, although my copy has become quite worn by now, with a nice full-color cover, nice stitched binding, well-indexed pages that are easily accessible from the outset, with an interior that is all black and white, with a 2-column format, mixed with inline tables, full page, and inline illustrations, and generally a well thought out design that truly sets the mood. The artwork, in general, is kind of an old school line art style, evoking not only the early editions of role-playing games in general, but also the specific feel and look of the Oran Empire, is the default setting for the game. I know a lot who watch my reviews may find that description very familiar in terms of the layout and, of course, the integrated setting, but in the sense of ACE, I was rather impressed by the formatting overall. Although similar to other OSR offerings, it very much felt like looking through one of the old TSR offerings, a feel that is sometimes missed even when, at least on paper, all of the other formatting elements are done in a similar manner. The setting is not well detailed within the core book, but rather is used to give an overall feel of a sort of ancient sword and sorcery style empire on the border between the classical and medieval eras, with only a few classes specifically referencing it. This not only sets the basic feel of the game apart from the high Middle Ages feel of certain other games, but also sets certain expectations in terms of the in-game economy that are used throughout the remainder of the systems of the book. That having been said, Adventurer Conqueror King can handle any sort of medieval fantasy genre and even beyond with ease without much alteration at all. Let's take a look at the contents. As usual, I'll go ahead and give a quick overview of the basics of the game, followed by a more rounded analysis at the end of the video. Aside from the foreword and some basic introductory material, the book is divided into 10 chapters. The introduction offers a quick overview of the basics of the game. The Characters chapter offers instructions on character creation, descriptions of the various classes, etc. The Equipment section covers not only the basics of money and gear, but also goes into the encumbrance system and the hiring of hirelings, henchmen, and mercenaries. The Proficiencies section covers the proficiency system, basically akin to non-weapon proficiencies from the AD&D era. Spells gives, well, lists and descriptions of the spells as well as the magic system. The Adventurers chapter goes into expanded details on rules for exploration, combat, movement, surviving threats and healing, morale, and much more. The Campaigns chapter covers more rules meant for extended play, from magical rituals and creating various creatures and constructs, to running strongholds or even engaging in mercantile ventures. Monsters is your typical list of monsters as well as their stats. Treasure gives rules for random treasure generation and descriptions of magical items, among other things. And finally, the Secrets chapter gives details on constructing a campaign as well as a sort of judge's miscellany of rules that don't quite fit anywhere else. So yeah, it's actually a pretty expansive system, covering not just your standard adventuring rules, but domain management and other non-adventuring campaign options. Well worth a closer look. The foreword is actually pretty long, having a mix of fiction based on actual play sessions, followed by a brief discussion of the rules shown in each section, which does a good job of not only giving a sense of the setting overall, but a sense of the scope of the rules that follow in the book beyond. It's actually a pretty decent way to start the book up. The introduction chapter follows, and it starts by describing the game in general, as well as giving a brief outline of the chapter, as much as I just did. It goes over basic terminology common to many OSR offerings, dice and dice nomenclature, but also gives the basic core rule of Adventurer Conqueror King System. Axe technically follows the BX lineage in many ways, but it has unified a lot of the mechanics into either a roll or a throw. This simply formalizes common dice mechanics, with a roll being the total of a dice and modifiers, and a throw being a die, almost always a d20, plus modifiers compared to a target value, much like the classic 3.x era d20 systems. This may seem like a basic thing to declare, but officially and formally defining these two roles and adjusting common rules from other OSR games to fit them goes far towards streamlining later rule descriptions and eliminating any ambiguity. Chapter 2 covers character creation. Axe uses a basic 3d6 in order roll with the classic 6 ability scores of Strength, Intelligence, Wisdom, Dexterity, Constitution, and Charisma. The ability score bonuses and penalty range uses a single table with adjustments of +3 to -3 distributed in a manner of the BX/BECMI era editions. Prime requisites do offer a up to 10% experience bonus, and there is allowance to sacrifice 2 points from one stat to boost another prime requisite by 1 point after the character's class has been chosen. Character classes follow a system very similar to the BX era, with races kept into their own classes, but with a few unique twists. There's the classic classes of Fighter, Mage, Cleric, and Thief, but also advanced classes or campaign classes such as Assassin, Bard, Blade Dancer, and Explorer. These campaign classes have some parallels with similar classes from certain other OSR systems and early editions of D&D, but they are fitted out in terms of lore and ability for the R and Empire setting. Fortunately, they are generic enough to fit into most fantasy campaigns as well. The demi-human classes are also a little bit different than is usually the case with OSR systems, since there's a couple of different classes for each of the two demi-human races, as well as a distinct lack of halflings, at least in the core book. Dwarves get the Dwarven Vault Guard and the Dwarven Craft Priest, while elves get the Elven Spellsword and Elven Nightblade. Each not only offers a mix of demi-human abilities plus a base class or classes, but also alters said base classes to feel a bit different from simply their human counterparts. As for each individual class, the write-up starts with their prime requisite, or even their prime requisites in the case of some classes, the ability score most associated with the class and from which they gain their experience bonus. There's any additional requirements they may have, their hit dice, as well as their maximum level. Human classes cap out at 14, while demi-human classes cap out at 10, which is a little bit more generous on the whole on the demi-human side than a number of OSR offerings. This is followed by a description of the class's abilities and the levels that they gain them at. One interesting thing about Axe is that all of these abilities are pretty formalized, and a number of them are reused between classes where appropriate. A few are even equivalent to function to certain proficiencies described later. Each class has a notation on what followers they get at later levels, as well as a template offered, giving a pre-made collection of proficiency and equipment that can be used to quickly generate a member of that class on the fly. The attack and saving throw table follows, as well as the level progression table that gives not only what experience is needed for each level, but also the title for that level in old school tradition, as well as any class-specific notes such as backstab progression or spell slots. Of note is that many warrior classes get a bonus to damage, which can go far towards balancing them against spellcasting classes, especially considering the relatively low damage bonuses that can be normally accrued in this game. Also interesting to note is the way that the attack throw progression acts like a saving throw progression in many other OSR games. You basically add the defender's AC to the attack throw target to get the number you have to meet or beat. Anyway, more on that in the combat section. To round out the characters chapter, there is discussion of forming parties as well as alignment. Axe uses a single alignment system of law, neutrality, and chaos. The equipment section starts with a basic description of the monetary system, which is fundamentally the same as in many OSR systems, followed by a standard of living cost table and the basics of purchasing equipment. Adventurer Conqueror King System differs from many other systems, OSR and otherwise, in that there is actually a market availability for all gear, at least after the initial character creation. I believe you started to see this in 3.x versions of the D&D system. This is useful because there is an actual economic system built in for higher level play, one which can be used to develop dominions and even engage in profitable trade. Rules on commissioning equipment are here as well, in the case that the party later wishes to commission a special weapon or set of armor or the like. The tables of equipment follow, giving just a basic list of equipment name and cost, with occasional descriptions of damage and AC where necessary for weapons and armor. This is followed by actual text descriptions of a number of pieces of gear, including any special rules that the equipment may need, which is something that I actually appreciate in any RPG system, rather than simply assuming that the player will already be familiar with various items. After this are the encumbrance rules. Now, Axe uses a sort of semi-abstracted system based on stones, which gives approximate weight on various items based in stones, as well as the modified movement for both in exploration and in combat, as well as running totals for different levels of encumbrance. Carrying capacities for various mounts and vehicles are given here as well. An entire section on hiring mercenaries, henchmen, and specialists of various sorts is given in this chapter, much more fleshed out than what you might expect in many other OSR offerings, since the accrual of a veritable war band of various followers, and eventually the raising of armies, is an expected part of Adventurer Conqueror King play. Rules for loyalty and in-depth descriptions of each type of specialist and henchman are given to round out the chapter. The Proficiencies Chapter follows. Adventurer Conqueror King uses a sort of generalized proficiency system similar to the non-weapon proficiency system from AD&D and AD&D 2nd Edition era. The key differences are the rate of acquisition, the grouping of proficiencies, and the fact that most of the proficiencies grant a flat bonus or an extra ability instead of requiring a check that must be passed, although some do actually partially mimic some class abilities. Some do have their own checks, of course. For instance, the adventuring proficiency that every adventuring character actually automatically gets enables the character to do a variety of general adventuring actions with a successful check. This can be anything from setting camp to kicking in doors and the like. Proficiencies are either general or within a class list, and characters get one of each to start with and get additional general or class proficiencies at levels based on their saving throw progressions. This does have the unfortunate side effect of loading proficiencies on some classes that you ordinarily wouldn't expect, but I suppose that is one way to do it, and it is fairly balanced. Proficiencies can be incredibly useful and can go a long way towards customizing a character. Some simply grant a minor bonus to some adventuring domain or other campaign act, while some may grant a special ability, such as the ability to identify items of a certain sort, execute a special combat maneuver, or, such as in the case of the healing proficiency, actually cast a particular spell with a successful proficiency check once you've donated enough slots to it. Most of this chapter simply details what each proficiency does. The next chapter is Spells, and it should be noted that Adventurer Conqueror King System is designed to be a little bit different in how it handles spellcasting than in other OSR systems. Rather than memorizing or preparing spells, characters have access to their full repertoire of spells known during any one day, although they are still limited by the numbers of slots per level in terms of actually casting the spells. This drastically improves the number of spells accessible at any one time, especially for divine spellcasters who have access to all of their spells of a particular level. For arcane spellcasters, the number of spells in their repertoire equals the number of spells that they can cast per day, plus an intelligence bonus for each of their particular spell levels, which does provide a fair opportunity for variation in a character's repertoire, but can drastically reduce the number of spells available for each level for certain other OSR systems, especially ones that incorporate an entire spellbook. Now, there is a spellbook system, which can be used to hold spells that you don't have in your repertoire currently. However, it takes a fair amount of time and cost to switch them out into your character's repertoire of known spells, so it's not something you're going to be doing at the drop of a hat. As far as actual casting goes, it's very much in line with other classic OSR and D&D systems otherwise. In terms of actual spells, each one has a name, a range, a level and type, a duration, and then a paragraph or more of description. There are up to 6th level arcane spells and up to 5th level divine spells. This is very much in line with early BX era spell lists. There are higher level spells than that, such as Wish and Resurrection, but they're not treated as typical memorize and cast spells. Rather, they're considered rituals and they're covered in the campaign chapter. In terms of actual spells, there's a number of the usual suspects: Charm Person, Sleep, Cure Light Wounds, and so forth. And generally speaking, spells have that sort of OSR-style power level, with some being quite powerful for their level. A few spells do bear specific changes to keep in mind, but no more than you'd expect from any individual OSR offering in that regard. So if you play a caster in Axe and have played one in other early edition Simulacrum, then it should be familiar enough of a system. Just read through the spells that you have just in case there's any minor details. The next chapter is Adventures, and this is where the general adventuring rules and background of the game are gone into. It starts by covering dungeon adventures, as those are the most classic ones, going over marching order and mapping, talking about time and movement. Axe does use as a 10-minute turn for exploration, for instance. Formalizing the need to rest is in here, as even for basic exploration. So for every X number of turns you spend, you have to actually rest for a certain number of turns. It covers light and darkness and their effects on adventuring, as well as listening to and opening doors, as well as detecting and handling traps. It goes on to cover wilderness adventuring, again mostly focused on exploration at this moment. It deals with movement in the wilderness, multipliers for terrain, rules for getting lost, rules for forced marching, etc. There's basic rules for dealing with rations and foraging, as well as air travel. Sea Adventures is next, and basic information is given for sea vessels and travel, weather conditions, getting lost at sea, and of course, rations and foraging at sea. General rules for encounters follow, starting with dungeon encounters, including setting the starting encounter distance, determining surprise and reactions. This is followed by a similar section for wilderness, then sea encounters. Specific rules for rolling what monsters are encountered follows, as well as surprise rules. Those rules, admittedly, are rather similar to what other BX-era OSR systems offer. Reaction rules are stated next, again similar to the source system, followed by rules for evasion and pursuit, for avoiding encounters, of course. Specific chase rules are again given for dungeons, wilderness, and sea. Initiative rules are next, with the default being individual/group of similar monster rules, with action declaration only sometimes in place. Rather than having to declare every action, basically if you're casting a spell or moving defensively, then you have to announce it, otherwise you just act on your turn. There's rules for combat movement covered here, as well as running and charging. There's rules for special actions, such as setting an attack versus a charge, moving defensively, and so forth. The basic attack rules are covered next, being basically an attack throw versus a difficulty target plus the target's AC. Dual wielding simply gives a bonus to hit rather than a second full attack, and the general focus on this system seems to be trying to avoid having player characters get more than one attack each round for the most part. Now there are exceptions, which I'll talk about later. Missile attacks and rules for grenade-style attacks are covered here, followed by spell casting and other actions. Damage is discussed next, which seems basic enough, but also covers how to double damage when double damage is indicated, which can be an issue in certain systems. There are rules for dealing with monsters that are immune to certain weapons and so forth. There's actually very general rules for what dice weapons are of a particular size and handedness, so you can actually use that to determine non-standard and non-listed weapons. Characters reduced to 0 hit points or less aren't automatically dead, but rather there's a sort of mortal wounds system that is rolled after combat is over that can determine whether a character died or suffered other effects at random. This can be more interesting and slightly more forgiving than simply killing a character, and because there is a penalty for leaving them to bleed out at a certain point, it does kind of reward swiftly resolving a combat. There's rules for non-lethal damage and healing, as well as rules for cleaving, which does actually allow multiple attacks, but only for certain classes against minor enemies. This can help thin out hordes of goblins at higher levels. Rules for saving throws are here, and there's a table of effects for mortal wounds, which can determine whether a character was killed or maimed after being knocked to 0 hit points, as well as a tampering with mortality table that can provide side effects even when bringing someone back from the dead successfully. Rules for a variety of special maneuvers are given, including many that are treated as feats in more modern role-playing game systems. It's relatively thorough in how it handles things, and many of the rules are quite similar to how they're resolved, continuing Act's propensity for a high degree of internal consistency. Morale rules are of course built into the main system, as they are in any really good OSR system, and the chapter wraps up with information on mounted and sea-based combat, before covering experience gained from adventures. Acts does grant experience for gold recovered, and there's a very strong link between the 1 gold piece equals 1 experience formula that actually goes into more systems than just leveling up, as you can tell from the campaign chapter. And of course, the next chapter is the campaign chapter. And this is the one that covers what you'd need for more extended play. It starts with rules for magical research, as well as rather extensive rules useful not only for researching magical spells, but also the creation of objects and other effects. This goes directly into the magical item creation rules, which are almost as thorough as one might expect in a more modern 3.x system, a little bit simpler due to the simpler base system overall. There are rules for ritual spells that follow, as well as some examples. These are more loose, since these spells are what might be 7th to 9th level spells in other games, and they're more powerful, or just powerful enough to have entire adventures based around them. They're really handled more as in-game events than something to be memorized and cast on the fly. Rules for creating magical crossbreeds and necromancy follow for those who want to go the old-school evil wizard route. There is discussion of divine power for those clerics who want to amass large congregations or utilize certain blood sacrifices and other chaotic arts. Extensive rules for constructing strongholds and running dominions follow, as is expected because it is a large portion of play at higher levels. Now this covers a fair number of pages and goes into quite a bit of detail for growing domains over time, investing in them, the minimum costs you need to keep them safe and happy, etc. Rules for more specialized strongholds are here as well, such as the Thieves' Hideout, as well as the hijinks one might send lesser guild members to accomplish from those. Mages actually get sanctums and dungeons as their strongholds, meaning yes, you can be that wizard who carves out their own dungeon lair and fills it with weird flying sharks with laser beam eyes. And there's a certain degree of reward to doing that as well, since that means you actually have a ready supply of monster parts for item construction. You can even go so far as to seed your dungeon with treasure to attract wandering monsters or the occasional low-level adventuring party. Rules are given for mercantile ventures as well, Trading goods from one market to the other seems to be a fairly decent source of income in this game. It can even be a viable way of making money and earning experience for some characters, and I wish it was a rule set that was developed in more RPGs in general. In fact, the chapter concludes with details on gaining experience from campaign actions such as running and building up your own domains, making items, and profiting from guilds and trading caravans. There's even a little bit of notation for earning experience as a 0th level character, in case you've got some 0 level hirelings that eventually start adventuring with you enough to actually become adventurers in their own right. The next chapter covers monsters, and is mostly just a bestiary. It does start with a description of the monster layout, special abilities common to a number of monsters, a few different monster types relevant to certain spells, and then goes on into the actual creatures. Now, if you've ever played BX or BECME as a game, you should be familiar with the format of the stat blocks. Each monster block has a name, a % chance of it being in that monster's lair, the number for a dungeon encounter, either random or in the lair, small or similar numbers for wilderness encounters, which generally tend to be larger for most monsters, the overall alignment of that monster, movement rates, armor class, hit dice, attacks, damage per attack, saving throw used, morale, treasure type, and then experience value. This is followed by a description of the monster and any special attacks that they may have. Some monster art is provided, but it's mostly just silhouettes. For the most part, there's their usual non-intellectual property monsters, although there are a few oddities adapted specifically for the Aran setting. The existence of beastmen, for instance, supersedes some of the humanoids from other campaign settings, and there are a lack of a large number of extraplanar beings. Now, there are a few, but for the most part, you're not going to find huge reams of demons and angels in this particular setting. All in all, though, for those familiar with classic OSR-style games, the monster list will actually be very familiar. The Treasure chapter follows and begins with rules for treasure generation. Treasure categories in Adventurer Conqueror King follow similar treasure categories to classic D&D, with some more suited for individual treasures while some are suited for larger lairs. There's rules for determining gem value and quality, as well as jewelry that will be familiar to veterans of the game, and yet with different progression from what you'd expect from other systems. There are some examples of special treasures useful for breaking up treasures instead of just assigning vast numbers of coins, as well as rules for scavenging items of value for low-level or broke adventurers who just want to take whatever scraps they can from the battlefield. There's guidelines for identifying and using magic items that follow, and then the grand magic item tables, which should be familiar to any OSR/D&D player by now. I will say that the items in Adventurer Conqueror King System very much follow the BX or BECME stylings, with item bonuses being in the +1 to +3 range. Items do tend towards a simpler feel than in advanced versions of various OSR games, etc. The tables are, of course, followed by descriptions of each item in turn, which includes many classic items, but it's a far briefer list of items than in many even other OSR games. There are rules for sentient weapons as well, which is akin to those in earlier editions of D&D and very similarly laid out. Interestingly enough, there is a bit of a departure from many OSR systems in that there are actually pretty well developed rules for buying and selling and commissioning magic items. This is not to say that it is easy to do or similar to something you'd expect in a 3X world where you just pop on down to ye old magic shop. However, it does do a good job of making trading magic items a rare thing, almost as rare as actually finding them, but details the procedure enough to provide a very good baseline of what to expect. Rules for commissioning items are included as well, of course, which is more understanding given the Conqueror/King section of this system. One can certainly expect the ruler of their own domain to try to spend a fair amount of resources to get an item that they really need. The final chapter, Secrets, details what you need to create a campaign. It starts with a decent guide to mapping and developing the setting, including what sorts of realms and realm population can be expected, how many of each subdomain may be found in the domain of a particular size, and so forth, at least based on the default Aran Empire assumptions. This extends to individual towns and villages, and I have to admit that the information provided is extremely useful. There's rules for setting up different demand for different types of goods in markets of particular sizes, with modifiers based on terrain and age, as well as creating individual cities of particular sizes. There's guidelines for creating and stocking your own dungeons, although there's not the sort of randomized dungeon generator you'd see in certain other old-school games, although I suppose you could just use one from one of those. Guidelines for creating various encounter tables for both dungeons and wilderness are in here, as well as for detailing NPC parties that you might run into. Additional rules follow all of these as basically a judge's miscellany, starting with aging rules, poisons, different kinds of slaves, since that's a thing and setting is similar to the Auran Empire, sinkholes of evil that are created when large numbers of undead and other evil creatures congregate in an area, rules for character transformations in the case of lycanthropy or other transformative magic, guidelines for creating characters above level 1, and finally a reading list kind of reminiscent of Appendix N. So, that's all that's in the core rules, and honestly, that is a lot to consider. I have stated that I like the Adventurer Conqueror King system before, so bear that in mind, but I will try to keep it as fair as I can as always. We'll start with the basics of presentation. Adventurer Conqueror King system is well written and well edited, and that's something I rarely get to say. It is very easy to understand even for a new player and very easy to navigate. There are very few rules that are difficult to work out where they hide in the book, which so often happens, and typos, word misuse, dead references, etc. are all negligible to absent. I honestly didn't notice any myself, although I'm sure there's one or two in there somewhere, as there always is. As I mentioned earlier, the artwork and layout makes it feel very much like an early TSR-era offering, without being a direct rip-off. Even the physical construction of the hardback I have is extremely well done. I don't know if that carries over to other print runs or sources, but for what I have, both in terms of the physical product and the contents themselves, Adventurer Conqueror King System is a well-crafted RPG product, and as well as I have pretty much ever seen. I will say this doesn't quite extend to certain of the supplements, since many of them are either print on demand, or at least it seems that they're print on demand, or bound much, much more cheaply, unfortunately. In terms of completeness of a system, it ranks right up there with the BECME titles Rules Cyclopedia in terms of having a one-book solution that can be used to run games for years and years without expansions. Now, there are expansions, and I will talk about them. I'll mention them here, but I may talk about them at a later date, since they are all also very well designed, at least in terms of content, and really expand the system in important ways. But taken as just the core book, that's literally all you really need. Adventurer Conqueror King system starts with a core of BX flavor and expands it to BECME levels of completeness, and then takes the various subsystems within those old editions and attempts to bring them more into line with one another, providing a much higher degree of internal consistency. And those who have watched my reviews know that internal consistency ranks right up there along with craftsmanship and usability in terms of what I really look for in a role-playing game, and Adventurer Conqueror King does well on all accounts. In terms of extra systems, the domain rules presented are well done and run relatively swiftly, especially once the judge gets the world worked out. The fact that you can viably be a trading character focusing on mercantile ventures, or a classic mad wizard with a labyrinth that attracts monsters and potentially even lower-level adventuring parties, really gives more options than just your typical dungeon crawling and wilderness exploration role-playing game. It provides an excellent development track even once you've started to cap out your characters. The expanded campaign rules and the ability for 0th level characters to eventually earn experience and gain a class gives a real multi-generational feel to the game. It feels like you could run the same setting on and on for years, gradually phasing out characters as the in-game years pass on, leaving their mark upon the world and raising new faces to leave their mark as heroes for the next generation. And that really speaks to me. The guidelines for campaign creation at the end are some of the most thorough, mechanically speaking, that I've ever seen in a game, and honestly I have used them to help determine the appropriate settlement density and trade good demand webs in campaigns that I've made for other systems. Now that isn't to say that everything is absolutely great about Adventurer Conqueror King. While it does expand on the sort of BX feel, it doesn't really go too far beyond it as far as mechanics go. If you're familiar with that sort of twilight area between BX and BECME and want more of that, well, this isn't really going to give you much more. Rather, it just polishes what those systems already offer to a fine sheen. Further, and it's an attempt to streamline the systems and make them more internally consistent, it has broken instant cross-compatibility with certain other OSR systems and clones. For instance, the AC system is unlike what you'd see in other games. It is mathematically similar, so you could easily convert material, but you do have to know what to convert before you go in. The reliance on the Oran Empire setting is also something to keep in mind. Prices, populations, and even the monster types pretty much assume that you're either playing in that setting or have something very similar, and this does crop up from time to time. If you want to depict a different historical period, you'll want to adjust either the gold piece conversion, the population density, or more. Fortunately, this is easily done, but it does require a bit of math. Certain monsters that are common in other settings may be completely absent from the Oran Empire and will have to be created whole cloth or adapted from another supplement. Furthermore, while complete, the campaign building rules at the end of the book do require some time to actually use, so if you want to fully incorporate things like market classes and such into your campaign, you're going to need preparation time. It'll be time well spent, but it's time nonetheless. As for my use of the system, I honestly would use it more if I could incorporate it more easily into the virtual tabletops that I use. I can't currently. Right now, it's one of those systems like GURPS that I absolutely adore but relatively rarely get to run. I will say that I do use it as a source book for other systems far more than I actually get to play it, and it's actually open on my desk more than other systems which I actually play. And that's just a shame, actually pretty sad, because given the choice, I would almost rather play Adventurer Conqueror King System than BECME, and that's saying something. I'm currently using this, as well as its companion Domains at War Mass Combat Rules book, as supplements for a 5th edition campaign that I'm running. That having been said, I do recommend it either as a standalone system or just as an inspiration/supplement for other OSR or D20 systems. It's weird because honestly, as much as I'm going on about it, there's nothing in this system that I haven't seen in some form or other elsewhere. It's just having all of those rules so well put together and integrated so nicely within one product is just honestly kind of awesome. Adventurer Conqueror King System just seems to be one of those RPGs that feels better than the sum of its parts look on paper. And although this review does focus on the core book, there are supplements, such as the Player's Companion, that not only adds more classes, but also a few new proficiencies, as well as class creation and spell creation rules that formalize ways to craft new spells. There is the aforementioned Domains at War offering that offers an entire wargaming system for low fantasy and sword and sorcery style genres, and the Heroic Fantasy Handbook that offers options for low fantasy and sword and sorcery genres of various sorts in terms of classes and basic adventuring. There is a layers and encounter guide that offers a whole slew of detailed layers and encounters. I have that, I just don't have it on hand right now, as well as a system for hunting and salvaging creature parts. There is an entire supplement devoted, for instance, to the shot and pike era of history as well, if you like that particular genre. Keep in mind that all of these have very compatible systems. They actually seem like they're of a consistent whole rather than just a system of the week that's been tagged on without regard to how they stack up with other systems, as you see in very often in modern role-playing games. So yeah, Adventurer Conqueror King System it's excellent. I'm not going to lie, it's excellent. I honestly would love to use it even more than I already do. But I love even more that when I can't convince my group to actually use it, I can at least use the book as a subsystem for other games. At the very least, more designers could take a lesson from the writing and the editing of the book as well. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up here. This has been the RPG Crawler with my shelf of many things, Adventurer Conqueror King System. As always, I'll go ahead and put a link to where you can pick it up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.